For most people, World War I is remembered as a political and military catastrophe, a conflict sparked by alliances, nationalism, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. But beneath the battlefield narratives lies another story, one that rarely appears in textbooks. It's the financial story of a banking system under enormous strain and how the outbreak of war unexpectedly became the mechanism that saved it from collapse. To understand why, we need to go back to the decades before the war, when the global financial system was expanding faster than ever before. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe had built an interconnected web of banks, credit institutions, and international investments. Capital flowed across borders at unprecedented levels. British banks financed railways in Argentina, French investors funded Russian infrastructure, and German banks poured money into industrial expansion across Europe. On the surface, this looked like a golden age of finance, but the prosperity had a hidden weakness. The entire system relied heavily on debt and fragile confidence. Banks had issued far more loans than the hard reserves they actually held. As long as economies kept growing and investors remained optimistic, the system appeared stable. But if confidence broke, the entire structure could begin to unravel. And by the early 1910s, the warning signs were already appearing. Industrial competition between European powers had intensified dramatically. Germany's rapid rise as an industrial giant threatened Britain's financial dominance. France was deeply invested in Russian debt, which made its financial stability tied to the uncertain Russian economy. Meanwhile, governments themselves had accumulated massive debts while trying to maintain military strength and colonial influence. Banks were at the center of all of this. They weren't just lenders to businesses anymore, they were deeply intertwined with government finances. Government bonds had become one of the primary assets held by major banks across Europe. If governments struggled to pay those debts, the banking system itself would face enormous pressure. This created a dangerous cycle. Governments depended on banks to finance their deficits, while banks depended on governments to remain solvent. If either side failed, the other would fall with it. By 1913, the global financial system was already experiencing stress. Credit was tightening. International capital flows were becoming more cautious. Some historians have pointed out that several European banks were dangerously overexposed to risky loans and speculative investments. The system was still functioning, but it was becoming increasingly fragile. Then came the summer of 1914. When the assassination in Sarajevo triggered a diplomatic crisis, financial markets reacted immediately. Investors panicked. Money began flowing out of banks as depositors feared instability. Exchanges across Europe faced sudden selling pressure. Within days, governments realized that the financial system was on the verge of collapse. In London, the world's financial capital at the time, the situation was particularly alarming. The London Stock Exchange was forced to close in late July 1914 to stop a financial panic. Banks feared massive withdrawals, and international payments were freezing up. Under normal circumstances, a financial crisis like this could have triggered widespread bank failures. But something unusual happened instead. Governments moved rapidly to suspend normal financial rules. Gold convertibility, the ability to exchange paper money for gold, was suspended in several countries. This was a dramatic move because the global financial system had been built on the gold standard. Under normal conditions, banks and governments had to maintain enough gold reserves to back their currency. Once that requirement was suspended, governments suddenly gained far more flexibility to create money and credit. And the justification for this extraordinary step was simple: the war effort. War provided governments with a powerful reason to expand spending on a scale that would have been politically impossible during peacetime. Military mobilization required enormous resources: weapons, uniforms, food, transportation, and millions of soldiers. All of this had to be financed immediately. War provided governments with a powerful reason to expand spending on a scale that would have been politically impossible during peacetime. Military mobilization required enormous resources: weapons, uniforms, food, transportation, and millions of soldiers. All of this had to be financed immediately. Instead of worrying about short-term financial stability, governments began issuing vast quantities of war bonds. These bonds were purchased by banks, investors, and ordinary citizens, creating a massive new flow of money into the financial system. For banks, this was a lifeline. The war allowed governments to borrow unprecedented amounts of money, and much of that borrowing flowed directly through the banking system. Loans that might have gone bad in a peacetime recession were suddenly absorbed into the enormous financial machinery of wartime spending. Industries that might have slowed down during an economic downturn were instead operating at full capacity to supply the military. Factories produced weapons and ammunition. Farms increased production to feed armies. Shipyards worked around the clock building naval vessels. This surge in demand stabilized the economy and prevented the kind of collapse that had threatened in the summer of 1914. In other words, the war transformed a potential financial crisis into an explosion of government-driven economic activity. Another crucial factor was inflation. Once countries abandoned the strict limits of the gold standard, governments could finance war spending partly by creating new money. Prices began rising across Europe. While inflation created hardship for many ordinary people, it had an important effect on government debt. It reduced its real value. Debts that had once seemed overwhelming became easier to manage when the purchasing power of money declined. This quietly relieved pressure on both governments and the banks that held their bonds. In a strange way, the economic chaos of war actually stabilized the financial system, at least temporarily. But this doesn't mean bankers wanted a global conflict or secretly engineered it. History rarely works that simply. The causes of World War I were complex and deeply rooted in politics, nationalism, and imperial rivalries. What is true, however, is that once the war began, the financial system adapted in a way that benefited banks and governments alike. The crisis that had been building in global finance was effectively postponed by wartime spending. You can see this pattern clearly when looking at the scale of government borrowing during the war. Britain's national debt multiplied several times between 1914 and 1918. France and Germany experienced similar explosions in public debt. And who managed much of that debt? The banks. Financial institutions helped organize bond sales, distribute war loans to the public, and maintain the flow of credit needed to keep the wartime economy functioning. In return, they gained enormous influence within the financial system. The relationship between governments and banks grew even closer during these years. Central banks took on new powers, coordinating with commercial banks to stabilize currencies and finance government deficits. This shift permanently changed the global financial system. Before World War I, the gold standard had limited how much money governments could create. After the war, many of those constraints had been weakened or permanently altered. Governments had discovered that large-scale borrowing and monetary expansion were possible if justified by national emergencies. The banking system had also learned that its survival could depend on government intervention during times of crisis. When debt levels rise and confidence begins to weaken, governments and financial institutions often look for ways to delay the consequences. Sometimes that delay comes through monetary policy, sometimes through restructuring debt, and sometimes, historically, through extraordinary events that justify massive economic intervention. World War I became one of those moments. The real question isn't whether those pressures exist. The real question is how long they can be postponed before the system is forced to confront them again. Because the lesson of World War I isn't just about banks or governments. It's about the fragile relationship between finance, power, and crisis, and how often history's biggest turning points are shaped not just by politics or war, but by the hidden pressures inside the financial system itself. If this gave you a new perspective on history and finance, consider subscribing. There are many stories like this, where economics quietly shapes the events that change the world.